Thank you.
Okay, so let me introduce to you Shelley Bridgman, transformational change and thought diversity expert. Do you know what? That just doesn't say it. That doesn't really do it for me. There is so much more to this woman. And hopefully, even on her birthday, she's going to ignite a spark, a positivity in you that you're going to walk away with a spring in your step. I know she will. Over to Shelley. I'm going to stop my share now. Please make sure you put your view onto speaker view to get the full benefit of Shelley here.
I don't know how anybody can call themselves an expert in these fields anyway, so I'll put a disclaimer in after that. I'd like to know, we've got some people from Malaysia, is that right? How many of you?
Hi, 2 of us.
Okay, well, I hope it doesn't sound patronizing, but I've traveled to over 70 different countries, and you would be very hard pressed to find one more beautiful than Malaysia.
Thank you.
So you're very blessed to, depending on what part you're in, I guess it will vary as well, but I did travel all over. So when Jill asked me to speak, knowing what your group's about, I thought I would like to do a short presentation, and then we're open to discussion, I believe, about the connection and collaboration, because I think it's hard to collaborate if you don't know fully who you are and what you stand for. It makes it more difficult. So I'd like to share a short story to begin. My journey began on a council estate in West London, and council estate, or project as you would call it in some parts of the world. I always joke that it wasn't rough, but the dogs went round in twos because it was such a rough and tumble place. But I remember growing up in an atmosphere of fear. And it wasn't because of where I lived. You don't know any different wherever you're brought up, because everybody's in the same position. But my parents had lost their first child, and it deeply impacted on them. My parents were stationed in what's now Israel. And on the 28th of January, 1939, Pamela was born. And on the 27th of May, 4 months later, she died of pneumonia. Now, my father was in the army, and the very next day they were due to be on a ship bound for England. And if you know anything at all about history, you'll know that it was only 3 or 4 months after that the Second World War began. So they weren't really given any choice. So they had a rudimentary burial and left instructions for a headstone, but they never actually ever saw the headstone, although they were sent a photograph some years later. Fast forward half a century, and I was organising a convention in Tel Aviv in 1989. And in conversation with my mother, I discovered that the cemetery was only about an hour from where I was staying. So she gave me the photograph that she had, and I made arrangements to go and visit the cemetery. We left early in a taxi on a Saturday morning to avoid the traffic, because Saturday being the Sabbath in Israel. And about an hour later, we got to the cemetery, and I was armed with this small, grainy black and white photograph of a headstone with 2 tiny trees behind it. And what greeted me was this vast cemetery with all the signs in Hebrew, which I don't speak. And as I entered, it was reminiscent of a war documentary, you know, where the camera pans back and you see row after row.
Shelley, we've lost your voice, my darling.
It just said the host muted me. Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but I've unmuted myself. I thought I'd offended you. So I entered this cemetery with all these rows and rows. I remember the smell of citrus and cedar in the air. And I discovered later there were 6,000 graves there, and all I had was this photograph. So I went up, searched up and down, literally about an hour and a half. And I suddenly looked at the picture and I thought, God, I was looking for these 2 tiny trees. And of course, 50 years later, they might just have grown a bit. And so I went to a more likely looking spot, but still nothing. And I was on the point of giving up because I had to get back to the convention. As I turned, I caught the photograph on my thigh and dropped it. And the breeze caught it and it bounced along the turf. And I ran over and stamped on it. And as I bent down and picked it up, I looked up and I saw my surname on the headstone. The hairs go up on the back of my neck, even now, when I recount that. But my response, which is the bit I wanted to share, really surprised me. I stood there and wept. I must have cried for about half an hour. I think I cried for my mother's loss. She was only an 18-year-old child herself at the time. My father, who never expressed his emotion because he wasn't shown any love. And I think I even cried for the land that I was standing on that had seen so much turmoil over the centuries. So the impact on our families and their systems, even before we're born, give us that connection, which is really what I wanted to share, whether we like it or not. And I remember I took some photographs, left and came back. But all through my life, I've experienced people stepping into my life at a time when I've needed it. Many years ago, I'd already said about the convention. I lost a travel business. I had to liquidate it. And I went into sales doing something completely new. Not very bright. I was desperate for money, so I took a job that only paid commission. But I'd been there a couple of months and they said that somebody wanted to mentor a group of us. And a man called John entered my life and he'd been the most successful person in the industry ever. And he offered to mentor the four of us. And I thought, well, this can't be this difficult. I'm just going to do everything this man tells me to do. But the interesting point was the other three dropped out within a matter of weeks. They didn't want to get up at 7 o'clock to make the phone call early, which is what he was telling us. They didn't want to read the books that he insisted on us reading. Because I was so hungry, I just did everything I could. And he was so pleased, he invited me to go up to a convention in Gateshead with him to be on a stage. And that was the thing that sowed the seed for my love of being on a platform. I thought I quite like this. Everyone's looking at me and paying attention. I realized, of course, there's a lot more to it after that. But he suddenly appeared at a time when I needed it. We were weeks away from having our house repossessed. And suddenly this man appears in my life. But you have to notice it when it happens. You all buy into collaboration, you wouldn't be here. And I experienced it again many years later. I challenged the government over a ruling about my legal status. And it was to do with rights. If any of you looked at my profile, you'll have seen that I'm a woman who was born as a male and I changed my gender when I was in my 30s. And I wanted legal recognition. And the only way I could get it was to annul my marriage. Now, I was still married and I've got 2 daughters. Why would I do that? So I challenged it through the courts. And at the first hearing, I lost and was told, don't bother appealing, there's no point. So I appealed. And I lost again. And again, they said, there's no point in appealing. You'll hear that there's a pattern emerging here. And then I got an email one day from a barrister who said, I do the occasional bit of pro bono work and I've heard about your case. I wondered if you'd like me to represent you. Out of nowhere. So she came on board. And then at one stage later, we had another email from 2 solicitors and they said, we've heard about your case and we quite like to help. And my barrister, Kerry, she'd already told me that it was getting a bit too much doing it all on her own. And we ended up in the Court of Appeal and the case was referred to the Supreme Court. And we had an email from probably the top QC on human rights in the land. And he said, I'd like to help you. So he represented us. And the Supreme Court referred the case to the European Court of Justice. That all took 10 years, that process up to that point. And 6 months later, there I was walking into this brand new court building in Luxembourg, the European Court of Justice. We were in the main court. And I remember walking in, you could smell the varnished newness. There was cedar everywhere. So if you imagine, I'm looking down the centre aisle, and behind me in an arc were the 17 ermine-robed judges, their glorious white wigs and ermine-coloured gowns. In front of them, lots of robed officials. To my right, the first 2 rows were full. I think there were 8 barristers representing the UK government, and 3 rows of solicitors behind them, and about another 20 rows of civil servants. There were 120. On my side, I had these 2 amazing barristers, 2 equally wonderful solicitors. They'd all worked for years for no fee, and the rest was empty. Knowing as I do that shame needs the oxygen of secrecy, I sat halfway down against the aisle. And when I looked over, I looked at the array of legal people, and I could have thought, well, you've got no chance with that lot. But I reasoned that they must be worried. And the case was heard. Every time a derogatory term was used to describe me, I looked across as they looked at me and smiled. Any shame I had was leaving during that day. And at the end, we all went back to the UK on a jet back into London airport, or the city airport. And 8 months later, the result came through via the Supreme Court, and we'd won. So I'm not going to pretend I did it for anybody else, but the law became binding in 17 countries. And what I realized, which I think most of you know already, is that when we stand up for something, good people show up. When they see that we're actually trying, but you've got to show up first. Too many of us wait for the person to show up before we do anything. And in my experience, nothing really works. Because what holds us back is, I mean, we're all sick to death of wearing masks, aren't we? The whole of the world's been wearing a mask. Yet most people I meet wear an invisible one their whole lives. And it's only when we take the mask off, we reveal our true selves, not to others, but to ourselves. Because until we do that, we don't find out who we are. And it's when the magic begins. Because it's then that we can face our fears, deal with our shame, and connect with what we value and deliver the unique contribution that only we can make. And we call that purpose. But with the mask on, we'll never find it. And in my experience, happiness and success are transient, fulfillment is lasting. And when we get in the arena and we take that step into the unknown, not just good, but amazing people will show up. Might be better if we actually ask them as well, but they tend to show up. And for my money, that's when life really begins, when we've done that and we've taken that mask off. And we appear and we make all the mistakes that we're going to make, because all we're left with is ourselves, with all our gloriousness and all our flaws, all our humanity. But everybody's born with what they'll ever need. You've only got to access the gifts you've already got and become the amazing person you already are. But you have to take, as I'm sure some of you have done, that first step. So I think I've just hit the 20-minute mark, and you gave me strict instructions, but I'm hoping we can have a discussion if I've said anything that sparked an interest.
First and foremost, Shelley, nailed it. I mean, I'm nodding in agreement, but my heart is singing, because everything you said is, I'm in total agreement with. When you stand up for good things, people show up. Shame needs the oxygen of secrecy. How true is that? So I wonder if we're going to go into a breakout session, and we will ask you questions at the end, but just while we've got all those things mulling around in our minds now, is there a question, or maybe two, that you would like people to consider? Because when we go into breakout, it's not in a normal place, you might be going, oh, I do this for a living and I do that. And this isn't what this is about.
I would ask a two-part question really for everybody. Are you connected with what your real gift is? And if you're not, do you know why you're not?
Yeah. That's beautiful.
And